As we head into summer, many people are sitting at work or at home, picturing what exciting things they might get up to on their holidays. If you're like me, you're going to want to spend as much time as possible with friends and family and then get out to many of the natural wonders that we have in Australia. The possibilities are endless, but we just need to realise the potential that we have. Imagine crystal clear streams, majestic towering trees, ferns and flowers in the undergrowth. Imagine a place where our most threatened species are protected. Critically endangered leadbeater's possums and swift parrots, endangered koalas, long-footed potoroos, greater gliders, giant freshwater crayfish, birds like Carnaby's cockatoos and wedge-tail eagles soaring overhead. Imagine forests soaking up and storing carbon in the most dense form known biologically and keeping it there for hundreds of years, helping to combat global warming. Imagine these forests purifying water and maximising its production without the need for expensive desalination plants. Imagine reducing the risk of wildfire without the need for extensive fuel reduction burns. And imagine beekeepers, custodians of some of the healthiest bee populations in the world, producing the finest honey in the world. Imagine walking tracks, horse trails, cycling routes through and connecting towns and forests. We don't have to imagine. This could be a reality. All we need to do is to stop the destruction of our precious forests by logging. I use the word destruction knowingly and advisedly. Native forest logging advocates like to say harvesting. They say it regrows. So let's unpack that. First up, let's remember that this matters. Our forests are one of the fundamental building blocks of life on our one and only planet. Our lives depend upon their lives, the services they provide to us, whether that be soaking up carbon dioxide, pumping out oxygen, or providing clean water. First up, for most of the forest logged in Australia, harvesting means clear felling, where 95% of the trees of all types are cut down, whether they are wanted for their wood products or not. Animals asleep in these trees crash to the ground or scramble to their lives to try and find new homes, almost certainly where there aren't any. The understory is crushed or ripped out of the ground by machinery. Roads, bridges, log landings spread out and across the land. There are narrow strips of forest left along creeks and random habitat trees left as lonesome sentinels. And then it's burnt. More often than not, the habitat trees die in the fire. And the understory, which survived the logging, is burnt to a crisp. And if the fire didn't get the habitat trees, then being exposed to the strong winds usually does. Then, on this blackened moonscape, reseeding is usually necessary, with a seed mix that favours a small number of trees that are favoured as wood production trees. And sometimes even that reseeding refails. The streams gradually settle, but siltation from the logging is often enough to destroy its value for species like freshwater crayfish, which can't cope with sand filling up all the cracks between the pebbles and the rocks where they live. And the plan is to do it all over again when the forest is 50 to 70 years old. No time for hollows to reform, which usually need over 100 years. And funnily enough, the animals that need these hollows haven't been able to hang around for 100 years. So yes, I use the word destruction advisedly. As for the wood, about 20% of the timber-yielding trees end up as saw logs. 80% go straight to the chip mill to be turned into paper pulp, either here or overseas. And of those 20% saw logs, only a fifth of those end up as long-lasting wood products, storing carbon as the floors, doors and window frames so promoted by the native forest logging industry. Yes, that's just 4% of the timber removed. That's how they try to justify this destruction. And every hectare of forest that's logged is subsidised by us, the taxpayers. We get less money for the wood removed than it costs to log them. It is not an economically viable operation. The other telling fact about logging in our native forest is that not one logging operation of public native forest in Australia meets the standards of the international certification system, the Forest Stewardship Certification, known as FSC. Not one. Forestry Tasmania and VicForest have applied for certification but haven't succeeded because they are still logging high conservation value forest, still logging forest that's home to threatened and endangered species. All they commit to is the much weaker Australian forestry standard, where they need to monitor operations, to take action to address threatening processes, but success of those actions is not required, and to minimise any adverse impacts of forest operations on significant biodiversity values. Monitoring and minimising, in the case of Leadbeater's possums and swift parrots, from endangered to critically endangered. It's a complete furphy that logging native forests is good for our climate. The evidence is unequivocal. The most comprehensive science about this is summarised in a paper by Heather Keith that was published last year, where they conclude the greatest mitigation benefit from native forest management over the critical decades within the next 50 years is achieved by protecting existing native forests. But we need wood, I hear you say. We love wood. Wood is natural. Yes, yes and yes. Here's the good news story. We don't need to log our precious forests to supply wood. 85% of the wood and paper products being produced in Australia and the majority of the jobs in the industry are in plantations. They produce reliable, high-quality and uniform timber and paper pulp. The Greens want to end the forest wars, and there's an easy way of doing that: to commit to shifting all logging out of native forest, plan the transition, set a timeline for each region, work out what additional plantation resource is needed, if any, do the research to maximise the value from plantations, work out the sawing technologies for sawn timber from eucalypt plantations. We can also make much better use of recycled paper. Australian-made 100% recycled paper ticks all the boxes as being ecologically sustainable and good for local jobs, but it's hard to fully support it when the company making it is also logging our precious mountain ash forests. The time is now. The legal framework that has enabled the destruction over the last 20 years are the federal, state, regional forest agreements. The first of these, the East Gippsland RFA, expires on the 3rd of February, before we return to this place next year. It and the other agreements must not be renewed or rolled over. They don't protect threatened species. In fact, the controls of the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act don't apply to logging undertaken under an RFA. All that's required is for threatened species recovery plans to be prepared, which provide no legal protection for some of the most endangered species in the country. I call upon the government to see some sense, to halt the rollover and start the planning to protect, not destroy, our native forests. And I can tell you something, the community will cheer. We recently commissioned a survey of residents of the suburbs of Brunswick, Northcote and Richmond in Melbourne. Over 90% supported the protection of our magnificent mountain ash forests in the Great Forest National Park. And 96% said that we have a moral obligation to protect Victoria's native forests for future generations. Until we move to a new future for forestry, where the regional forest agreements are consigned to the dustbin of history where they belong, having failed to protect both native forests and jobs, we are destined to continue the conflict that is as destructive to our society as clearfield logging is to our forests. After 35 years of working on this, I'm so frustrated that we are still warring over forestry. It would be so straightforward to transition out of native forest. It could stop forestry, could stop being controversial, and we could have a real, true, sustainable industry for the future.
Senator